Hello, everyone, and welcome to week two in international political economy. I hope you have gotten settled after week one and you're excited about now tackling some of the critical theorists in political economy. So, we've obviously touched on the classical political economists last week, looking at Smith and Ricardo and their contribution to understanding what was called the bourgeois economy. Now we're going to transition to have a look at their most famous critic, Karl Marx, who is obviously a leading figure in the critique of the classical political economists and has been an important historical figure since. So let me just progress the slides and these are the learning objectives today. So obviously we have quite a focus on Karl Marx, and I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And also just to note as well, we're not just interested in Marx the person, but also very much his thought and his methodology. So there's a few required readings there. And just again, as a reminder, please make sure that you're going to the area on Moodle where you can select what reading you'll be leading the discussion of in the book clubs. So we will have three of us leading the discussion of these required readings in our tutorials for week two. So we're just going to start with a broad overview, of who Karl Marx was. Because his biography is also very important to understanding a little bit more of his thought. So he was born in 1818 in the city of Trier in Prussia, and his family were Jewish and his father was a lawyer. So Marx initially entered university first at Bonn and later then at Berlin, where he read law, majoring in history and philosophy. He concluded his university course in 1841 and he submitted a doctoral thesis on the philosophy of Epicurus. So he was quite interested in ancient thought. And at this particular time, Marx was known as a Hegelian idealist after the very famous German philosopher Friedrich Hegel. And in Berlin, he belonged to a group of what were called left Hegelians, who sought to draw more atheistic or atheisty kind of and revolutionary conclusions from Hegel's philosophy, who were kind of opposed to what were called the right Hegelians. Now, after graduating from university, Marx had hoped to become a professor, but the reactionary policy of the Prussian government made Marx abandon that idea of an academic career. And he was subsequently invited to be the chief contributor to a newspaper called I won't be able to pronounce this, but the Rheinische Zeitung, or I've got it written there on the left-hand side. And this was a paper that was founded in opposition to the Prussian government. But within a year or so, the Prussian government suppressed it. Marx then married Jenny von Westphalen in 1843 and then moved to Paris. And this is where Marx also met Friedrich Engels, who was his lifelong contributor in the French city. And shortly after meeting, both of them worked to produce their first contribution together called the German Ideology. Now, at the insistent request of the Prussian government at the time, Marx was banished from Paris in 1845, as he was considered by both governments a dangerous revolutionary. Marx then moved to Brussels, where Marx and Engels joined a secret propaganda society, which is called the Communist League, at whose request they drew up the very famous Communist Manifesto, which appeared in February 1848. Now, on the outbreak of the Revolution of February 1848, Marx was banished from Belgium. He then went to Germany, but was banished from there. He returned to Paris, where he was once again banished until he moved to London, where he lived with his family until his death. Now, his life as a political exile was obviously an extremely difficult one. Poverty weighed heavily on Marx and his family, and had it not been for Engels' consistent and constant and selfless financial aid, Marx wouldn't have been able to complete his masterwork Capital, and he would have inevitably been crushed by hunger and malnutrition. But Marx's health did eventually become undermined by strenuous work, not only in writing, but politically. He was a part and a leading figure in what was called the First Internationale, which was a democratic movement in Europe. And he continued to work on the refashioning of political economy and on the completion of Capital, for which he collected a massive new material and studied a number of languages, such as Russian, German, French, and English, which he was also very fluent in. But ill health eventually prevented him from completing the last two volumes of Capital, which Engels would subsequently put together from his notes. And Marx's wife, Jenny, died on December 2nd, 1881, and then on March 14, 1883, Marx passed away peacefully in his armchair. And you'll see here on the slides, I've got a few notes of the publications that were released, but most of them were after his death. So like the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the 18th Premier of Louis Bonaparte, Grundrisse, and Capital, most of which were released after his death. So the question is, well, why do we study Marx today? So Marx strongly influences all critical schools today. And like I mentioned before, very early on, feminist schools, Gramscian, neo-Gramscian, constructivists, a lot of schools have a lot of debt to Marxist theory. So to properly understand the theorizing of these various schools, it's obviously important to conceptualize a little bit, at least, what Marx believed and what he wrote. And Marx obviously wrote at a time where capitalism was kind of just emerging or had established itself as a kind of world system. But still the dynamics that he identified and analyzed in his time are still very much today. So our society is still based on one that is functioning around commodity production, still very much obviously based on the capitalist mode of production. And very importantly, his great contribution to political economy among several is that he integrated the understanding of history into political economy. And this will be kind of the centerpiece of the critiques of the classical political economists that Marx mentions or goes into a lot of detail in criticizing, which we'll just mention, which is the ahistorical nature of the classical political economists, which is the main thing that Marx took them to task about. Now, some definitions before we start, and I'm just going to pause the recording just briefly. Hello, sorry everyone. I've just got a new kitten, Layla, and she is a little bit boisterous and very cheeky. So I just had to say hello to her. So some definitions before we kind of start talking a little bit more in depth about Marx's analysis of the political economy around him. So there's a few terms that will be used over and over again, one of which is a mode of production. So when we hear a mode of production, this is referring to a theoretical concept that talks about the entire social totality. So that's both the economic structure as well as other levels of the social totality, which is juridico-political, so legal and political stuff, and ideological. So it's a broad idea of the social entirety. Now, social formation is what's called, or what it refers to, a concrete, historically determined social reality. So it's not quite the ideal version of the mode of production. So when we talk about, for instance, the capitalist mode of production, this gives you an idea of factories producing commodities, which then structures the legal system, which structures ideology and so on and so forth. A social formation is historically determined part of that totality that we can see and we can study, where we might think about the capitalist mode of production, for instance. A particular social formation in a certain area would be something that we might actually be able to see and observe very specifically. Now, relations of production, which is the other main, the third type of major concept that Marx has used, is that according to Marx, people enter into definite relations with one another to produce commodities, for instance, on capitalism, and only within these kind of social relations does production take place. So you can say that the relations of production are the social relations which are found among people involved in the process of production. So, if you're an employee, you have a certain relation to the employer, and that's based on the production process. So relations of production is another important definition as well. Now I'll just advance the slides. So let's talk firstly about Marx's critique of classical political economists. Now, Marx had a really wide, diverse number of critiques against political economists before him, which is all outlined in the posthumanist book that he wrote called Theories of Surplus Value. Now, we're only going to explore really one or two this week mainly, because what I really want to focus on is the main plank of Marx's critique, where a lot of other critiques kind of radiate from, which was the lack of history considered by Smith and Ricardo. So, for example, Marx stressed that Ricardo, started his analysis by assuming, as given, the very phenomena, such as, the developed relations of the bourgeois economy, which he sought to explain. So Marx felt that this faulty procedure, which Marx likens to giving the science before the science, was precisely a reflection of the ahistoricism or lack of history of political economy. Ricardo commenced by assuming the relations of bourgeois economy as they were existing, so assuming that they were just natural, and he then counterposed directly the outward appearance taken by these relations on the surface of society with their inner source, which Ricardo had identified as the law of value. So Ricardo basically said that what we can see in the relations on the surface of society, which is like natural and normal, they produce the law of value. And then Marx would say that entirely missing from Ricardo's work is an examination of the historical and logical paths by which this law of value actually develops to produce the relations that you see in bourgeois economy. So it's not the other way around. And maybe to put it another way, Ricardo failed to trace the manifold links, or what Marx would call mediations, between the hidden inner determination of society that you can't see, which is called the law of value for this particular example, and the immediate phenomena, or the phenomenal forms in which the law might find its expression. So, like we mentioned last week, Ricardo focused on the labor theory of value. So he saw labor as creating value, which then expressed certain phenomena that you can then see, such as prices, profits, interest, and rent, and so forth. But Ricardo failed to kind of think about, well, how historically has the law of value developed to be able to give expression to these things that you can actually see and record. Because on the other hand, Marx argued that the capitalist relations of production are historical, unfolding with the passing of time, so that they will differ depending on the period in which they appear. And unless the given relations had achieved a certain level of development, it's of course impossible to clearly grasp them and establish them conceptually. So, for example, we talk a lot about today finance capital. But that is not something that Ricardo would have ever seen, right? And it first came into view more in the latter half of the 19th century. So it couldn't be discovered as a category of political economy before that time. If we want to kind of, make it a little bit more specific, Marx's notion of the ahistorical, we can go a little bit more into explaining, where the law of value came from, and based on Marx's analysis. So at one point, Marx draws attention to the fact that for thousands of years, ever since the appearance of commodity production in the ancient world, which is just making, things to trade, for example, people had always tried to discover, the nature of value, how do we make things that are valuable that we can then use to live our daily lives or trade for valuables. But it was only in the 18th century that people were able, through the science of political economy, to actually make progress along this road. And this was only possible because the social conditions in which political economy operated, the fact that commodity production was becoming predominant, made possible the clarification of issues which previously had, of necessity, kind of remained obscure. So, political economists could only see that the law of value was something that existed because there was finally widespread commodity production, which was, generalized in an industrial manner. Now, when Marx criticized the political economists for the ahistorical nature of their work, he meant that they could not grasp their own science had emerged and developed only under these conditions. Political economy instead labored under the serious misapprehension that all of bourgeois thought and the categories of its subjects, so when Smith and Ricardo looked at, value, capital, money, labor, etc., were not the product of merely individual minds, but that the laws which these minds had discovered were valid for all epochs. So they conflated the laws specific to a determinate capitalist mode of production with laws they thought to be universally valid. So Marx attacked the political economists precisely because they took the categories of their science uncritically. So his charge of the classical political economists being ahistorical meant essentially that the political economists fetishistically, so they fetishized the available concepts as fixed and unalterable. So political economy took its categories for granted precisely because it did not know the historical process through which they had created. Um, so it's no real accident, based on this, when we look at, Ricardo's work on one hand and Marx's work on the other, that Marx's work is very different from Ricardo's. And it's almost like it's opposite. So in the case of Ricardo, and you may have noticed this from the small amount of reading we did last week, all the historically developed economic relations of modern society are dealt with at the start of his work. He just outlines like what's there, which is very much different from what you see over the course of Capital, which is Marx's great work. So Marx shows not, in an opening chapter, but over 3 entire volumes, how the economic relations of bourgeois economy grow and develop. And this growth is both what he saw as logical and historical out of the relations of simple commodity production. And then in a 4th volume, which is called The Theories of Surplus Value, the theoretical reflection of this contradictory process in the work of all these leading political economists is examined. So Marx is aiming to demonstrate that the essence of all the contradictions of bourgeois economy has a common source within the commodity relation itself. But at the same time, the growth and development of this has to be demonstrated. So it would be perhaps wrong to think that all relations of bourgeois economy, even of politics and ideology and everything, can be explained by direct reference to Marx's opening chapter, where he looks at commodity production, which is the most simple, part of the capitalist system. It'd be equally wrong to believe that the more complex relations that grow out of that can be considered in isolation from Marx's analysis of the commodity. So throughout Capital, he goes from the simple to the very broad. And the most ordinary and fundamental, common, everyday relation of bourgeois society, which is something that's encountered literally billions of times, is commodity production. And in this very simple phenomena, which is even called the cell of bourgeois society, it reveals all the contradictions or the germs of the contradictions of modern society. So Marx's subsequent exposition shows us the development of these contradictions and of the society in the totality of its individual parts from beginning to end. And that's the grand purpose of Capital. So in the first volume of Capital, which we have a few readings, and I'll just see if I need to progress my slides yet. No, not yet. We'll touch on that soon. But in the first volume of Marx's Capital, he investigates this, genesis of capital, revealing that its origins lie in the simple commodity production and exchange, and the further development of the simple commodity production in the form of money then eventuates. He then very specifically in opposition to Ricardo demonstrates that capital is a historically formed social relation and not something that's assumed as given. Marx goes on to deal with the general nature of the relationship between wage, labor, and capital. Then in the second volume of Capital, the book Capital is concerned with the turnover or circulation of capital and the way in which this and other factors modify the analysis he's already made. And then finally, having completed these tasks, only then he is able to, in the third volume, deal with what we call the surface phenomena of bourgeois economy. So what we actually can see around us. So, like the nature of value, profit, those kind of things, and how these phenomena reflect in the production process itself. So in this way, Marx is able to show the appearance of the bourgeois economy are not natural, right? There's something that has developed over time. They're a product of definite historically formed social relations, and that the consciousness or the understanding of these relations is also not arbitrary. It's not merely like a false consciousness in this sense, but is itself an objective product of these social relations. So this is kind of the essence of Marx's critique of political economy, that Marx had to show that the conceptions of political economy were not, illusions in the heads of these individual thinkers like Smith and Ricardo, but were a product of and expressed really, objectively existing social relations in a necessarily contradictory and inverted form. And Marx notes the nature of this method at the start of the third volume. And this is word for word from Marx's third volume, just to give a really nice summary of the project of Capital. So in book one, we analyze the phenomena which constitute the process of capitalist production as such, as the immediate productive process, with no regard for any of the secondary effects or outside influences. But this immediate process of production does not exhaust the lifespan of capital. It is supplemented in the actual world by the process of circulation, so the movement of commodities, which was the object of study in book two. In the latter, namely part three, which treated the process of circulation as a medium for the process of social reproduction, and social reproduction means like the like renewal of society, like almost on an everyday level, right? It developed that the process of capitalist production takes as a whole represents a synthesis of the process of production and circulation. The various forms of capital, Marx says, as evolved in his book, thus approach step by step the form which they assume on the surface of society, in the action of different capitals on one another, in competition, and in the ordinary consciousness of the agents of production themselves. So just summarizing up again, the faulty kind of architecture of Ricardo's work, especially as well as Adam Smith, Marx felt that they hadn't properly investigated the economic categories that they assumed as presupposed. And this led to a series of interconnected theoretical misconceptions, which exposed Ricardianism to the successful attack of his opponents. So Marx does emphasize, in terms of Smith and Ricardo, both his indebtedness to them and the advances that their principles make, but at the same time, the inadequacy of their method. So, and we can say finally that the point can be summarized again in Marx's own words in his book, Theories of Surplus Value, that classic political economy seeks to reduce the various fixed and mutually alien forms of wealth to their inner unity by means of analysis and to strip away the form in which they exist independently alongside one another. It often attempts directly, leaving out the immediate links, to carry through the reduction and prove that the various forms are derived from one and the same source. This is, however, a necessary consequence of its analytic method, with which criticism and understanding must begin. Classical economy is not interested in elaborating how the various forms came into being through, historical analysis, but seeks to reduce them to their unity by means of analysis, because it starts from them as given premises. But analysis is the prerequisite of genetical presentation and of the understanding of the real formative process and its different phases. So this is, again, a broad summary of Marx's critique of the classical political economists. Now, what's really interesting here for us as scholars of political economy, and, if we want to investigate Marx, is to really understand his method. Because, and Marx was also very clear himself that even near the end of his life, there were people who started to call themselves Marxists, who, took little parts of what he said and held that as true through any kind of context and time. And that really, really, annoyed Marx a lot. And he explicitly said that he was not a Marxist. And his, from, a different kind of school of scholars around who look at Marxism, say that the important thing about Marx is the actual method that he brought to studying political economy. And this is something that I'd also reflect as well. I think it is what we might call a very orthodox Marxist method of looking at Capital, Grunrisi, and his other works, and like seeing, a quote or a little part of that book and, taking that as kind of gospel or some kind of truth. But the most important thing for me, as a, political economist, is to try to use Marx's method, which is very, very elaborate and very complex, and is something that is certainly not taught or discussed about in most university courses around Marx, because it is often a very hard concept to grasp. And really, if we, and this is just going to be a bit of an introduction around Marx's method, if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of understanding Marx's method, you need to understand the philosophers and other political economists that it was talking with and against at that time, and no more importantly than Friedrich Hegel, who was an incredibly complex German idealist philosopher who very much, whose methodology informed Marx's own. But we'll just keep quite broad, which I think will very much help you, and something I want you to think about when you're planning your own theoretical framework for your major assessments. So let's talk about how Marx investigated the bourgeois economy. Now, in terms of theory, Marx utilized what we call a relational ontology. So this is something we mentioned last week. An ontology is you look out at the world and it's what you see. So when Marx looked at the world, he saw relations between, objects, people, and processes. So for instance, when he saw a simple commodity, he did not just see this particular object, like, a coat, for example, or a pin or whatever it was, but all the relations that produced and circulated that object around the world, whether that be the workers who made it, the capitalists who financed it, the ships that moved it, the consumers who purchased it, et cetera, et cetera. So he took an ontology, which is one that we call relational, so a relational ontology. Now, there's generally seen as like two major ontologies of relationism. There's a philosophy of external relations and then one of internal relations. And I'll deal with both, but Marx's approach was a philosophy of internal relations. Now, starting just to contrast it, the philosophy of external relations, which is very much one that most of us will be familiar with because it reigns in kind of the common sense and learned and especially natural science discourse of our time, holds there are both things, out there and relations and connections between them, but they're logically independent of each other. Okay, so there's things that you can see like objects and they might be related, but that objects and their relations are independent. So in principle, the relations between two or more things can undergo dramatic change and disappear altogether without affecting the qualities by which we recognize these objects in themselves and with which we define the terms that refer to them, right? And the same approach is taken to the various stages through which anything passes. So as with relations, change is viewed as external to the thing itself. So something that happened or will happen to an object, whatever performs that change is treated independent of, of what it is and what it was earlier, rather than an essential aspect or stage of what it is. And probably the best example I can give with this is like when, for example, you plant a seed, it turns into a tree, it grows a fruit. In a philosophy of external relations, there are three objects there: the seed, the tree, and the fruit. And there's a growth relationship between them or development, like the seed sprouting and growing into a tree, the tree producing fruit. There's, different relations between them, but they're totally separate objects. And the relations that are happening to them, or the growth that's happening to them through, photosynthesis and other natural science phenomena, they're independent of those objects themselves. So that is kind of, I hope a nicer relation of demonstrating a philosophy of external relations where they see, change of something through various stages, but as separate individual objects throughout. Now, with this way of organizing reality, both perception and conception tend to concentrate on small, relatively isolated and static things. So they'll just see like one particular thing and study it. And with them, the many relations and changes only receive kind of serious attention when they bump into other objects or we bump into them, for example. And this is very common, for those who are familiar with natural sciences who might, be studying an atom and they're only kind of interested in the atom itself or the particular particle. And then when it bumps into something, there's an interest there. But that's kind of the extent of it. And again, there's separate processes. So there's an atom or an object or a particle, and then when it bumps into things and changes things, then that's a separate relation. But changes and relations are the basic building materials of a bigger picture in every sphere of reality, and reducing them to the role of like bit players in a drama whose overall plot is of little concern results in a kind of partial, static, and one-sided thinking, which is characteristic of most bourgeois ideology, as Marx would argue. So in contrast, Marx's philosophy of internal relations, which again a lot of social scientists use today, holds that what others take to be a thing that may or may not undergo change and may or may not have relations with other things is itself both a process and a relation. So what was a thing for the philosophy of external relation becomes a relation evolving over time. So for instance, that example between the seed, the tree, and the fruit would be that is one thing evolving as a relation over time. And so the qualities that followers of the, philosophy of external relations ascribe to a thing are not denied by, philosophers of internal relation, but are seen and transformed into aspects or moments that can serve as vantage points from which to view and study their relations, which include direct, indirect relations and changes, which are understood essential aspects of what they are. And I'll provide a couple of examples in a moment to hopefully illustrate that a little bit better. So then the question is, if we're using a philosophy of internal relations, the main thing that we want to be considering is how do we understand the relation between any particular small thing that we analyze and the whole, social structure in which it's located. Because again, a philosophy of external relations sees one thing interacting by itself and then not the whole around it, not all the things that it has interconnections with. And so for the philosophy of external relations, the whole is simply the sum of the existing parts that are there. Whereas the philosophy of internal relation goes further than this and treats all the relational parts as, when extended to their furthest limits, as so many versions of the whole. So the one-sidedness of the external philosophy of relations is a product of where one begins to examine the interactions and changes that go on and its role in establishing the order, visibility, and relative importance of the rest that comes into view of the system as a whole. And this also means that only by studying, enough of the more important relations that make up any whole can we hope to have an adequate understanding of what it is, how it functions, where it's tending, its patterns, and how we can affect it. So while the whole of the social totality, which philosophers of internal relations are concerned about, most of its distinctive characteristics come, from the interactions and changes that take place in its smaller relational parts. The whole also acquires over time and with its own growth as a pattern of its constituent parts, some characteristics that pertain to it and it alone. Now, a very simple, and this is the example that I was promising, a simple illustration of this ontology guided by philosophy of internal relations would be simply like looking at a book. So where mainstream or, philosophers of external relations would just see this book as a lifeless object just sitting there, a relational ontology guided by a philosophy of internal relations says that this book expresses and relationally contains everything within it, from the fact that there's light on that you need to read it, to the social practices and institutions of society which make the whole work possible. So when we're trying to understand, for instance, like a book as a particular object, you're not just thinking about the book, you're not thinking about the microatomic structure of it, for example. And you're not only worried about relations when, you throw it and it hits someone, for example, and then you'll look at the force and the acceleration of that particular work. No, when it's like sitting there in front of you, you're thinking about, well, who constructed this book? How is it possible for me to read this book in terms of like the learning and the education that I had to underdo? How do I read this in terms of the light that's around me? For example, so that brings in so much more structures of society to understand. So this helps us understand how broader structures in a social totality determine the possibilities of an individual object, rather than seeing, society as only having like, individual objects and people randomly interacting in atomistic matter. So a philosophy of internal relations, the analysis can then address what we call reciprocal relations between, people, objects, and structures, which have like external connections and histories that contribute to a social world full of reciprocally determining transformations. So that basically means like, the whole world is constructed of everything in relation to each other, which, it's not just a one-way relation, it's always back and forth. So very classically for Marx, he, for instance, as we mentioned, analyze the appearance of commodities. So like, how did commodities, how do they get made? And that was his starting point. And he argued that the production of commodities demonstrated the wider relations of the whole. So, as soon as we, for instance, think about commodities and selling them, this presupposes a population of people who are going to be wanting to buy them, right? So there has to be people there. So that broadens our analysis more. And then this population must be producing in certain relations to create this commodity, which also means and requires a certain kind of family or commune and a certain kind of state. So just by looking at, commodity production, you can broaden the analysis of, well, how does that commodity production, occur in this social totality, which connects a lot of other aspects to it. So it gives us a framework of understanding how aspects of the broader social totality relate within a historically given context, aiming to reveal the underlying logic that structures those relations. And now there's the idea of capital is really important here. And I didn't want to give this as a definition before, because capital, the idea of capital that Marx, keeps referring to, which is obviously the title of his book, is very much guided by a philosophy of internal relations. So most economists and, others in our society at the moment use the term capital to refer to a thing, such as the means of production used to produce goods, or at most maybe two things like, money invested in this and related activities with the aim of making a profit. These things are obviously caught up in many different relations, but working out of philosophy of external relations, capital is viewed as existing apart from and logically independent of all of its relations. Now, Marx, on the other hand, describes capital in the following, very many ways. He firstly says, capital is a definite social production relation, or capital is the alienation of the condition of social production from the real producers. Capital is value that sucks up value-creating power, or capital is not only a sum of material products, it's a sum of commodities, of exchange values, of social magnitudes. So you can see that there's so many different ways that, Marx conceives of one particular thing, and this is from a philosophy of internal relations, which means the idea or understanding of one particular thing is historically determined and determined by its context. So this is a really important part of Marx's philosophy and approach. Now, broadening this a little bit, and sometimes academics and other critics conflate between the philosophy of internal relations and the dialectical method. And they are, more or less very similar things. And we won't be able to go into dialectics in a lot of detail here, because it does require a quite thorough understanding of the Hegelian method, which is the method by the German idealist philosopher Friedrich Hegel. But the dialectical method, you may have heard it kind of bastardized as this idea of you have a thesis, an antithesis, and then a third point, which is like the solution as such. So you have and this is common in what you call dialogical arguments. So you have someone taking one position, another person taking another position, and they argue, and then you're coming to a third kind of solution position, or like it might be between the two. One might take over the other. This is something that if you search for the dialectical method on Google, it'll keep coming up time and time again. And I want to really emphasize that is absolutely not the dialectical method. It is something that has been very very simplified and characterized of both Hegel's philosophy, which explicitly said it was not this triangle of dialectical method, and also certainly not a method that Marx used either, even though some of Marx's followers since then have talked about the dialectical method in this manner. But the dialectical method is very complex, and it can be broken down to a lot of successive moments. And the Ullmann reading that you have for this week will help you a little bit here. And if you want to know more about the dialectical method, Ullmann is a really excellent author who has numerous books on this, and especially his book Dance of the Dialectic is particularly good. It takes you step by step very simply through this process. But I want to mention the two main ontological and epistemological points of the dialectical method. And the ontology is what we've kind of already spoken about, that dialectics means looking at the world as one that's composed of an infinite number of mutually dependent processes and relations that form this structured whole or totality. And then there's this epistemological moment, which, remember which is about how do we actually understand this world out there of all these relations, which is about how to organize our thinking to understand this world. And this deals with opting for the philosophy of internal relations that we've already spoken about before. So as an ontology, we see all these relations out there, and we know it's existing. And instead of taking like an external philosophy and trying to understand that external, philosophy of external relations, we take a philosophy of internal relations. And so again, like I mentioned before, these are, dialectic is a very broad and difficult part to understand. But the main kind of point that I want you to take away from it is that it's based on a relational, firstly, a relational ontology, and then a philosophy of internal relations as an epistemology. If we can talk a little bit more about the Hegelian dialectic if you're in my Thursday class, if you'd really like to, but I'd really recommend Ullmann's books here as well. Now, finally, just the final point that I just want to touch on before we finish up here is that another way that Marx's method is also spoken about is one of historical materialism. So again, it's a little bit tricky, I'd say, to separate historical materialism from the philosophy of internal relations. The philosophy of internal relations is the epistemological part of Marx's theory. He sees relations ontology, and then historical materialism is more like the methodology in a sense. So it's more about how he then goes to conduct the analysis, and how Marxists after him have done so as well. So Marx, for instance, saw relations as constituting the social world. He saw the production of a commodity, and to start analyzing it, so to actually, try to understand the commodity in relation to the whole, which is the capitalist bourgeois economy, he then looked at the history behind that commodity. So how did that commodity become as it is today? So that's the historical part of his methodology. So he looked at the movement of the production process throughout history. Like for his time, it would have been looking through the feudal ages and see how you got to the social relations to actually be able to produce this commodity. And materialism is a term that you might see quite often. For a natural scientist, materialism means that when you look at things, it is composed of materials, right? So we're composed of atoms. So that's the idea that the crude materialism of natural sciences is the idea that everything is constituted by atoms, right? That is materialism from a natural sciences perspective. From a social sciences perspective, materialism usually means the processes of producing things that people materially need to live. So this is about, producing commodities. This is about reproducing ourselves as individuals and communities daily. So this is, really simple everyday processes. This is like going to your job, and this is again, obviously, in a capitalist social totality, going to your job, earning a wage, coming home, eating food, being reinvigorated for the next day. So materialism is about, well, how do people go about actually reproducing, surviving, and continuing with their lives. So this is the methodology of Marx's approach. So I realize there's probably quite a lot of information there, and my broad goal here is that to provide a very, very, very brief overview of Marx's critique of the classical political economist, of his method, and really hopefully get you a little bit interested in learning more. If you have a look at the recommended readings as well, there's some good resources too, and unlike probably Ricardo and Smith, Marx's works are a little bit more accessible, to some extent. Certainly Capital Volume 1 is very much an accessible book, even though it's obviously quite a thick one, but also the Grundrisse and some of his journalistic works, such as the Louis Brumier and other works as well. So hopefully you have a bit of an encouragement to read more, but thank you very much for tuning in. And sorry, I was interrupted a couple of times by my little kitty Layla, and I look forward to seeing you guys in week 2 of classes.